It always fascinates me how many figures in philosophy, weren't just content to analyze the world.
Yeah.
Like they wanted to use those insights to actually create something new.
Yeah.
And today's thinker, Friedrich Schiller, is a perfect example. I mean, this is a mind celebrated for these amazing dramas and poems, some of the most enduring in the German language. But he also took on this whole philosophical project, trying to reshape how we understand things like beauty, freedom, even what tragedy really means.
Right.
So we're going deep into the thought of Friedrich Schiller, a figure who really straddled those worlds of art and rigorous philosophical thinking in a really deep way.
Absolutely. And I think for someone with the background in philosophy, the path that Johann Christoph Friedrich Schiller, born in 1759, took is super interesting. It's not like he was just this, literary giant. I mean, we're talking about the Robbers, Maria Stuart, the huge Wallenstein trilogy, and of course the Ode to Joy. But he became a serious philosophical thinker too. Like between 1791 and 1796, he put out this body of work that, while a lot of it focuses on aesthetics, has these really sophisticated ideas that reach into ethics, metaphysics, ontology, even political theory. His impact on later German idealist philosophy is pretty unique, especially coming from someone so prominent in the arts.
Right. It's not every day that you see a literary superstar making such a decisive shift, like diving headfirst into abstract philosophical questions. What prompted that kind of intellectual transformation?
Well, a few things came together, and for a philosophical mind, they actually paint a pretty coherent picture. So Schiller was becoming more and more disillusioned with how the French Revolution was unfolding. Things were descending into the terror. That probably pushed him to think more deeply about the nature of freedom and what an ideal state should really look like. And at the same time, he was dealing with some tough personal stuff, like a pretty serious illness. And he was going through this period of real self-doubt about his writing, specifically his plays. It seems like philosophy became this space for him, a space for intellectual recovery, maybe even a source of new ideas that could help him get his creative spark back. And the fact that the Duke of Saxe-Weimar gave him a pension at that point, like the financial support, really made that intense period of philosophical focus possible.
So for our listeners, maybe someone who gets excited by how abstract thought connects to actual lived experience, maybe someone who's already wrestling with how aesthetics relates to other parts of philosophy. Well, today's deep dive is going to explore the core of Schiller's philosophical contributions. We're especially interested in his unique perspective on aesthetics and how it's deeply tied to ethics, to freedom, to our very nature as humans. Hopefully, by looking at these ideas through his historical and artistic lens, we can kind of shake things up a bit, get you thinking about these classic philosophical questions in some new ways.
Totally. And it's crucial to remember that Schiller was really engaging with the ideas of Immanuel Kant. Like, Kant was this huge influence. At first, he was really inspired by how powerfully Kant talked about human freedom, that whole idea that we have the capacity to determine ourselves.
Yeah, determine yourself from within yourself. That's such a classic philosophical idea. Gets right to the heart of autonomy. But where did Schiller start to disagree with Kant, especially when it came to understanding beauty and how we experience it?
Well, Schiller thought Kant's framework for thinking about aesthetics had some limitations. Specifically, he had problems with two of Kant's main claims. First, Kant argued that there's no such thing as an objective principle of beauty. For him, judging something as beautiful was completely subjective, just a matter of personal feeling. And second, Kant said that aesthetic experience was all about the pleasure you feel as the subject, like it had nothing to do with any inherent qualities in the object itself. Schiller's project, especially in his early writings on aesthetics, was basically to challenge these subjectivist ideas and try to put aesthetics on what he saw as a stronger, more independent, and objective foundation.
Okay, so that brings us to his Cullius letters. This is a series of letters he wrote to his friend Kerner. It gives us this fascinating glimpse into how his thinking was developing. What were the big arguments Schiller made there as he tried to give beauty a more objective grounding, something that would satisfy a philosophical mind?
In the Cullius letters, Schiller uses a method that anyone familiar with Kant will recognize. It's kind of like transcendental deduction. He's basically asking, what has to be true about the way our minds work to make our experience of beauty possible at all? And he ends up concluding that we humans must have two basic and distinct kinds of reason: theoretical reason and practical reason.
Right, theoretical and practical reason. So for our listeners who are probably comfortable with these categories, how did Schiller define their roles?
So, the way Schiller saw it, theoretical reason is mainly about using our cognitive abilities to connect different ideas and representations to, create knowledge about the world. When you apply it to abstract concepts, you get logical judgments. When you apply it to your sensory experiences, you get teleological judgments, judgments about purpose or design in nature. Practical reason, though, operates in the realm of action. It connects representations with the will to actually make things happen. And its core principle is autonomy, or freedom. When practical reason guides our free choices, it produces moral judgments. And here's where Schiller does something really new for aesthetics. He says that when practical reason is directed toward what he calls unfree effects, basically, stuff in the world that we don't directly create with our will, like appearances, that's when we make aesthetic judgments.
So to Schiller, seeing something as beautiful isn't just this fleeting, subjective feeling of pleasure, like Kant said. It's actually a cognitive recognition of something much deeper. It's about perceiving freedom and appearance in the world around us, a kind of objective counterpart to our own experience of being free.
Exactly. And because freedom is the main thing that defines practical reason, Schiller argues that beauty, at its core, is freedom in appearance. But then, of course, that raises a big question for the philosophical mind. What specific qualities does an object have to have for us to see this freedom in appearance, and how can we, as rational beings, reliably know it when we see it?
And Schiller gives some pretty specific and interesting answers to that, right? He brings in these concepts of being determined through itself and the even more nuanced idea of autonomy. Let's break those down for our philosophical listeners.
Right, so Schiller identifies two main qualities that make us judge something as beautiful. The first is being determined through itself. This means that the object has a kind of internal autonomy. It feels like its existence and actions come from its own inherent nature, not because some external force is making it do something. His famous example is comparing a Spanish palfrey, which is a type of riding horse, to a regular workhorse. Even when a workhorse isn't carrying anything, it often still walks in this heavy, labored way. It's like you can still see the effects of all the loads it usually carries. It doesn't seem to be moving purely from its own, inner vitality.
Whereas the palfrey moves with a grace and lightness that suggests its movements are a pure expression of its own nature, not constrained by external forces. It's a really striking image of something acting in accordance with its own internal principles, not some external mandate.
Exactly. Schiller thought that the beauty we see in animals tends to decrease when they seem to be dictated by gravity and, the need to just function, rather than expressing their inherent form and vitality. And this analogy helps him connect aesthetic judgment to practical reason. He's suggesting that both of them are recognizing a fundamental form of self-determination. He even says, and this is a great quote, "Self-determination of the rational is pure determination of reason, morality. Self-determination of the sense world is pure determination of nature, beauty."
Wow, it's a powerful link, right? Tying our understanding of moral autonomy with how we experience beauty in the natural world. And then there's the more complicated idea of heteronomy. How does that build on his understanding of objective beauty?
Heteronomy literally means self-governing. It's a step beyond just regular autonomy. It means that the object's form isn't just self-determining based on some external principle, but it actually defines that principle itself. It's like the rule that governs the object is both given and obeyed by the thing at the same time. Think of a really well-integrated landscape, like in nature. All the elements, the shape of the land, the plants, the water, they all work together harmoniously, as if they're setting their own inherent limits and connections. Or imagine a dance performance where the movements are super skilled but also seem completely effortless, as if the dancers are just following their own spontaneous impulses.
It's almost as if the object is both embodying and enacting its own inherent laws of being, right? It's not just conforming to some pre-existing rule, it's actually the source of that rule.
Sure. Exactly. And Schiller takes this idea and applies it to human actions, too. He says that truly beautiful actions have this quality of spontaneous self-determination that comes from the very essence of the person acting. His different versions of the Good Samaritan story illustrate this really well. In the fifth scenario, the Samaritan acts purely out of his own goodness, like he loses himself in the act of helping. And Schiller argues that this action is particularly beautiful because the autonomy of the mind and the autonomy of the appearance perfectly match up. It's suggesting that the highest form of moral character is when duty becomes an intrinsic part of who you are, a moral beauty.
Now, it's important to acknowledge here, especially for our philosophically minded listeners, that even Schiller himself and lots of critics who came after him weren't totally convinced that this initial attempt to deduce beauty in the Callias letters was completely successful. Like, the exact philosophical status of beauty as freedom and appearance, whether it's just a guiding principle for how we judge things, or whether it's a real quality that's out there in the object itself that's still being debated within aesthetics.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the Callias letters might not have settled the question of objective beauty for everyone, but they were really important for how Schiller's later ideas about aesthetics and ethics developed. His claim that aesthetic judgment belongs to practical reason was super important for his later explorations of the aesthetic parts of moral action. And his dynamic concept of form provided a really compelling alternative to Kant's more subjective take on aesthetic experience.
Which takes us right into his essay from 1793 on grace and dignity. Here, he goes even deeper into this connection between morality and aesthetics, especially focusing on the aesthetic aspects of moral action, which we touched on with that Good Samaritan example.
Exactly. In On Grace and Dignity, Schiller really gets into Kant's question about how duty and inclination work together in our judgments of moral worth. And he uses the concepts of grace and dignity as these potential bridges between the moral and aesthetic spheres, which a lot of people see as separate.
Let's start with grace. How does Schiller define that, and how does it connect to his overall understanding of beauty?
Schiller kicks things off by looking at the ancient Greek myth about Venus's girdle, this magical thing that could make even someone who wasn't conventionally beautiful seem graceful. This right away tells us that grace and beauty, while they're connected, aren't the same thing. Schiller says grace is an objective quality. It exists whether anyone perceives it or not. And because movement is the only way an object can change without changing its identity, he concludes that grace has to be understood as beauty of movement. It's also interesting that the Greeks usually only talked about grace in terms of human beings, beings with moral sentiments. So, like, inanimate objects can't be graceful, but when we see grace in human action, it means something about their freedom, about their personal merit. And he ultimately defines grace as beauty of form under freedom's influence.
And Schiller points out this really cool paradox about graceful actions. They're deliberate, they come from our will and freedom, but they also look natural, almost instinctive. How does he explain that?
He makes this distinction between actions that are directly willed, from our conscious choice, and actions he calls sympathetic. These sympathetic actions, while they're still ultimately willed, look involuntary. It's like they come from these deep-seated moral feelings instead of a conscious decision-making process. And while Schiller agrees with the rigorous moralists that true moral worth comes from following the objective moral law, he says an action can be both morally worthy and graceful if it seems to flow naturally and effortlessly from the person's character. It's like it's motivated by feelings that are themselves the result of that person's moral development. So grace, in this sense, is about the way we act. It's an expression of our moral attitude, and it looks so natural that the person doesn't even seem to know they have it.
And this leads to his concept of the beautiful soul, which is this state of being where your ethical sense guides your feelings so well that you can trust those feelings to guide your will too. You're free from any risk of moral contradiction. It sounds like this ideal of human existence where everything is integrated and harmonious.
Yeah, it's definitely presented as an ideal. The beautiful soul, for Schiller, can do even the hardest moral duties with such ease that it seems like they're just natural inclinations. They follow reason with joy instead of seeing it as some external rule. And it's in the beautiful soul that these seemingly opposite things, sensuousness and reason, duty and inclination, they all come together in harmony. And grace is like the outward sign of that inner unity. And because we instinctively recognize this harmony as like a picture of human perfection, it naturally makes us admire, approve, even love that person.
So grace, as we see it in the beautiful soul, bridges that gap that Kantian philosophy might seem to create between morality and aesthetics. It shows how they're really connected. And Schiller seems to be saying that cultivating our sensual nature in line with reason is a better way to develop morally than just trying to suppress our senses.
Exactly. But Schiller also realizes, he understands human weakness, that this ideal harmony isn't always possible, especially when we as sensual beings face pain and suffering, things that can really challenge our rationality. And that's when dignity comes in.
Right. When pain might make us act against reason, our ethical self has to step up and resist being controlled by our physical state. And in that struggle, where the beautiful soul can't maintain its harmony, we see a different kind of moral excellence, moral greatness, or dignity. How does Schiller describe this shift from the graceful soul to the sublime soul in the face of adversity?
When someone refuses to give in to pain, when they don't let it make them act against reason, the beautiful soul kind of transcends itself, becomes what Schiller calls a sublime soul. And its outward expression changes from the effortless charm of grace to this steadfast strength of dignity. Schiller uses this really powerful image, a person in extreme physical pain but still composed. Their movements are gentle and deliberate, their face is relaxed, their eyes and brow are calm. This contrast between the intensity of the suffering and their calmness shows us that there's a power independent of suffering, an inner peace in suffering that's the essence of dignity. In fact, Schiller actually changes his mind later and says that the most complete expression of humanity is when grace and dignity are combined in the same person.
And it's worth noting that Kant himself actually engaged with these ideas that Schiller was developing about how duty and inclination relate. He even dedicated a whole footnote in his Religion within the boundaries of mere reason to clarifying his own position in response to Schiller's thoughts. That says a lot about the impact Schiller was having on Kantian ethics.
It really does. On Grace and Dignity has become a key text in Kant scholarship. People see it as a potential contribution to Kantian moral psychology, and it's a major argument for an ethics of character based on Kant's ideas that takes our feelings seriously. And Schiller's focus on how moral actions appear to others has been praised for highlighting how important appearances are in how we understand and judge the world.
Okay, so from this relatively harmonious ideal of grace and dignity, Schiller then turns his attention to tragedy, to the pathetic, to the sublime. These essays are like him going even deeper into human dignity when we face suffering.
Right. In essays like On the Art of Tragedy, Schiller grapples with this weird thing, how we as humans can actually get pleasure from watching other people suffer, especially in plays and stuff. He uses that classic Kantian distinction between reason and sensibility, arguing that our ability to control our immediate emotional reactions and choose the moral law instead gives us a unique kind of pleasure. When we see other people going through that same struggle, trying and sometimes succeeding at putting their will above their senses, it allows us to recognize and appreciate what Schiller thinks is the most amazing thing about us, our free will. That vicarious experience and the sympathy it creates is what he initially sees as the main purpose of tragedy.
So in his early work on tragedy, it seems like Schiller thought of it as this art form that imitates the struggles of being human. And by doing that well, it can create this sympathetic pleasure in us as we see reason win out over our desires.
Yeah.
He even gave advice to people writing tragedies on how to get that kind of emotional and intellectual response from their audience.
He did, yeah. He said it was important to show unavoidable moral conflict, the hero choosing to face that conflict even though it'll cost them, to portray suffering vividly and movingly, and to build the plot in a way that gets the audience emotionally invested while keeping this balance between despair and hope.
But then, in his later essay on the sublime, Schiller seems to shift his focus a bit. He moves away from sympathy as the main thing about tragedy and starts to embrace a more Kantian idea of the sublime as the key to its power.
Exactly. Building on his earlier distinctions between the sensual and the rational, he defines the sublime as this complicated, often paradoxical emotion. It's where our senses hit their limits when faced with something incredibly powerful or dangerous, but at the same time, our rational mind feels this deep sense of its own superiority and freedom from those physical forces. And this leads him to distinguish between the theoretical sublime, where our reason grapples with the vastness of infinity, and the practical sublime, where we confront nature's destructive power and become aware of our own inner calm and intellectual self-sufficiency. It's in these intense moments of experiencing the sublime that we truly grasp that our moral self is untouched, inviolable, even if our physical body is destroyed.
And he takes it even further by distinguishing between the magnificent, where we actively overcome something scary or dangerous, and the truly sublime, where we might physically lose to some force, but we don't feel fear at a deeper rational level. He even brings in the pathetically sublime, which is specifically about witnessing suffering in a way that triggers this interplay of fear and transcendent understanding.
Right. The pathetically sublime, for Schiller, needs a few things. An objective force that can cause harm, our own vulnerability to that force, and yet this underlying sense of security, this unshakable belief that our rational will is free and strong no matter the physical threat.
And in concerning the sublime, he argues that experiencing the sublime shows us humanity at its most noble. He says there's nothing beneath the dignity as to suffer violence. Like we can resist violence not just physically, but also idealistically, by consciously going beyond our purely natural existence, by choosing to submit to suffering in a way that actually affirms our freedom. This paradoxical embrace of suffering for a higher purpose is what establishes our moral self-sufficiency.
Exactly. For Schiller, being able to feel the sublime isn't just passively receiving something, it's a really glorious part of being human. He argues that while beauty creates harmony within us, it's the sublime that really tests us and reminds us of our dignity and freedom. He even says that beauty and the sublime together give us a complete picture of human nature. They let us be complete citizens of nature without being slaves to it, and at the same time be active participants in the world of reason and morality without ignoring our physical existence.
And art, especially tragic art, plays a huge role here. It's like a training ground for these sublime emotions. By showing us artificial misfortune, tragedy lets us practice being independent and acting as a kind of inoculation against unavoidable fate. It helps us manage our emotions when we face real tragedy and makes us morally stronger. It's a powerful idea seeing art as training for our emotions and our morality.
It is. And in On the Pathetic, Schiller makes it clear that showing suffering in art isn't the goal itself. It's a way to show human freedom. The full salvo of suffering and tragedy only becomes truly aesthetic when it makes the audience feel the sublime, when they recognize and affirm human freedom even in the face of awful things. His example of the Laocoon statue, where you can see the internal battle between physical pain and spiritual strength, even as he's being strangled by the snakes, is perfect for this.
And he points out this potential disconnect between our moral judgments and our aesthetic appreciation. We might admire someone's freedom, and will, even if they're doing something morally wrong, like in his example of Peregrinus Porcius, who dramatically set himself on fire. It shows how moral law and our interest in human agency and freedom can be in tension.
Definitely. Schiller admits that, as an audience, we're often more drawn to displays of power and freedom, even if they break the rules, than we are to just following the rules without that spark of individual action and will. His ideas about tragedy and the sublime were hugely influential. Thinkers from Nietzsche, with his Apollonian Dionysian thing, to contemporary philosophers working on courage, coming to knowledge through suffering, moral conflict, and renunciation, they've all been influenced by him. But there are criticisms, too. Some people say he focuses too much on the individual and not enough on society and politics. Others say his rational view of suffering misses its real significance and how it feels to actually experience it.
Now let's move to his really ambitious work, the Letters on Aesthetic Education. This is probably Schiller's most comprehensive theory, covering everything from his take on the French Revolution to basic questions of human psychology to his vision of the ideal state.
It's a massive work, yeah. Schiller is trying to figure out what's wrong with modern society and offer a way for us to flourish. He starts by being pretty critical of the current state of things. He talks about societal decay, how the hope for freedom after the Enlightenment has kind of faded, and how crude instincts and a lethargy of spirit are dominant. He blames this partly on the Enlightenment's focus on reason at the expense of feeling, which he thinks led to the violence of the French Revolution. For him, the most important thing is to develop our capacity for feeling in a balanced way, without neglecting reason.
And the tool for achieving this balance, art, of course. He makes this passionate plea to artists, urging them to ignore the distractions of their time and surround people with great and noble forms of beauty, to keep influencing us until semblance conquer reality and art triumph over nature.
Yeah, that's the idea. But Schiller, being the rigorous thinker he is, realizes that art can also be corrupting, which means we need to figure out what real art and true beauty actually are. So he uses a transcendental approach, saying that we can't just define beauty based on historical examples of art. We have to figure it out based on the potential of our sensio-rational nature.
And this is where he introduces his famous distinction between the person, which is about our autonomy and form, and the condition, which is about our physical existence and matter. He really emphasizes the need for us to integrate these seemingly opposite parts of ourselves.
Right. And this integration, Schiller says, is driven by two basic human drives: the sense drive, or Sachtrieb, which is about our physical existence and self-preservation. It's governed by our senses and makes us temporarily suspend our rationality. And then there's the form drive, or Formtrieb, which is about our enduring personhood and our desire to go beyond the limits of time and change. It's concerned with things like necessity, eternity, truth, and right, and it's the basis of our dignity. The tension and balance between these two drives is key for us to develop and flourish.
Which leads to the emergence of the play drive, or Spieltrieb, when the sense and form drives are in balance. This play drive wakes up when we're aware of our freedom and our existence at the same time, and it helps us reconcile these seemingly opposite parts of ourselves.
Exactly. The play drive basically annuls time within time, harmonizing the forces of becoming and being, change and identity. It frees us from being dominated by either our senses or pure reason. And the thing that best activates and sustains this play drive, Schiller says it's living form, or lebendige Gestalt, which is essentially beauty. When we experience beauty, like in the Juno Uffizi statue, we feel this balance of our sense and form drives, a state of both deep calm and intense inner activity.
And it's through this experience of beauty, brought about by the play drive, that we become truly free, according to Schiller. Because we're no longer controlled by either our senses or pure reason alone, our will is finally free to choose. This dynamic integration is what it means to be fully human, which leads to his famous statement. Man only plays when he is in the fullest sense of the word a human being, and he's only fully a human being when he plays.
It's such a powerful statement, and it shows how important this balanced, integrated aesthetic state of being is for us to be fully human and to thrive. And while beauty itself doesn't give us knowledge or make us morally good, Schiller argues that by achieving this harmony through aesthetic experience, we reach our full potential for both. Real art, by creating this lofty equanimity and freedom in us, makes us better at everything we do. He even called beauty a gift of humanity itself, a kind of second creatress that shapes our inner world.
He then talks about energizing beauty, which makes us tense and react, good for people who are too focused on their senses, and melting beauty, which makes us relax, good for people who are too focused on their intellect. And he says we need both to be truly balanced. He also outlines these stages of development for both individuals and humanity as a whole: physical, aesthetic, and moral. The aesthetic stage is the bridge from being ruled by nature to living in accordance with reason and freedom.
Yeah. He even speculates that our aesthetic sense might come from the carefree joy and creativity we see in nature. This abundance in nature, he says, inspires in us this indifference to reality and interest in semblance, a way of finding deeper meaning and using our imagination that's uniquely human.
And he applies these developmental stages to political states, too, which is interesting. He imagines a progression from a dynamic state of rights based on force to an ethical state based on abstract laws and duties, and finally to his ideal aesthetic state, where citizens are naturally inclined to be good and just, embodying a balance of reason and feeling.
And while he admits that this aesthetic state is rare, maybe only existing in small groups of really cultivated people, his vision has sparked a lot of debate. Some people ask whether the aesthetic state is a means to an end or the end itself. Others criticize it for being elitist and out of touch with real politics. But the aesthetic letters have been super influential. The concept of play resonated with later philosophers like Peirce and Gadamer, and the idea of art as a cure for alienation influenced the Frankfurt School. Even today, Schiller's ideas about aesthetic value and freedom are really relevant to philosophy.
Finally, we get to On Naive and Sentimental Poetry, where Schiller uses another dichotomy to understand the modern human condition, focusing on our relationship with nature and how it makes us feel.
Right. Schiller starts by noticing how much we like certain things in nature, like flowers, animals, simple gardens. And he says our pleasure isn't just about beauty, it's also moral. We appreciate nature's silent creativity, its ability to act serenely on their own, its inner necessity, and its eternal oneness. These things make us feel like these natural beings are what we used to be, what we should be. And this recognition creates a complex emotion and a mix of sadness that we've lost that unity and pleasure in our own freedom.
This leads to his distinction between naive and sentimental. The naive, whether it's a child acting on instinct or an artist who seems guided by nature, represents a direct, unreflective connection to nature. It's pure, simple, direct, and effortless, kind of like Schiller's ideal of the ancient Greeks.
And in contrast, the sentimental shows how modern humans are aware that we're separate from nature. Modern poets, unlike the ancient ones who felt naturally, now feel the natural. They focus on their own perspective, their thoughts, their awareness of the distance between them and nature. It's a more complex and divided consciousness.
But Schiller says the sentimental isn't worse than the naive. It's actually a higher stage of development. It's about striving for something infinitely great instead of just achieving finite greatness. He doesn't want us to just mourn the loss of unity, but to take nature up into yourself through thought and creativity and create something new and even better.
And this divided consciousness of the sentimental poet opens up new possibilities for literary genres that explore the relationship between the real and the ideal. This leads to his categories of satire, which thrives on the contrast between them, comedy and tragedy, which highlight incongruities, and elegy and idyll, which show harmony between the real and the ideal. He even says comedy is higher than tragedy because its goal is to free us from passion and help us accept life's absurdity with clarity and composure.
And Schiller takes this naive sentimental idea beyond art and applies it to how people approach life. The naive sensibility is the realist, who focuses on observation and practicality, trusts their senses, accepts what's necessary, and aims for happiness and prosperity. Their morality is about the overall balance of their life. The sentimental sensibility is the idealist, who speculates, relies on their own reason, has a purer morality but less conformity. He ultimately argues that we need to balance these two sensibilities to understand ourselves and the world.
His analysis in On Naive and Sentimental Poetry has been super influential too. It shaped German Romanticism, influenced Hegel's ideas about ancient and modern art, Nietzsche's early concept of the naive, and even later thinkers in poetic phenomenology.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Friedrich Schiller, it's clear that he's still incredibly relevant, especially for us as philosophers. He bridged art and philosophy, offering lasting insights into freedom, beauty, the relationship between our senses and reason, and the power of art to shape us and society.
Absolutely. And for our listeners who are interested in philosophy, Schiller gives you this historical and conceptual lens to look at ongoing debates. His work is a framework for thinking about aesthetics, ethics, politics, and human flourishing. There's a lot to agree with and disagree with, which makes it even more interesting.
And to leave you with something to think about, Schiller was all about the importance of play and the aesthetic state for us to reach our full potential. So how could a society intentionally cultivate these things, which might seem pointless in its social structures, education, and culture, to create greater well-being for everyone? And given his ideas about the naive and the sentimental, how do these show up in our culture and art today? And what does that mean for us?
Those are great questions that Schiller's work makes us think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the thought of this amazing figure. We encourage you to explore his writings and think about how his ideas still influence us today.